The table saw is one of the most versatile machines in the wood shop, and for me, it's a machine that I couldn't woodwork without. You can make a ton of different cuts with it, ranging from a simple rip cut all the way to unique cove cuts, like this board. And in this video, I want to explain all these different kind of cuts, how you can create them safely and effectively, and how you can boost your skills on the table saw. Let's get right into this.
Shop Fix. It's for the love of woodworking.
The main cuts on a table saw are utilizing the rip fence, and we're going to be ripping boards long ways. Okay, so when you go to position the rip fence, you're going to be wanting to measure your cut from the inside of the rip fence to the outside of the blade. And we're going to lock that in. However your table saw fence locks into position once you've measured your cut from the inside of the fence to the right side of the blade. Your table saw is likely to come with a tape measure, which you can utilize to easily dial in your cuts. Two things about the board that you're ripping out. One, it needs to rest flat on the surface. So you can easily check that by setting the board down and then trying to rock it back and forth. If it rocks back and forth because of a bow or a cup, you're gonna have to either hand plane that or use a jointer to get that flat enough to where it's not rocking. And then another thing is the edge that you're ripping on needs to be as straight as possible. And what I mean by that is that it has to be parallel to the rip fence. And so ideally, you'll be using a jointer to joint one edge of the board so it can be perfectly parallel to the rip fence. And that's going to give you a nice safe cut. There's a few things I'd like to mention about the actual act of cutting and ripping on the table saw. Besides using a push stick, you'll also be pushing the lumber with your hands and positioning your body. There's two different ways I like to do this, and it depends on what I'm cutting. For this small lumber, I'd like to position myself to the left side of the blade so that I can put some pressure into the rip fence and also push it forward. Once it starts cutting, I'll just simply grab my push stick and then push it the rest of the way through with my body on the left side. A lot of the positioning is for safety. You don't want to be directly behind the blade and just pushing like this. I would not say that's the proper position. I would definitely say either you're pulling the board into the fence from the right, or you're pushing the board into the fence from the left. Okay, so now we've covered all the basics to make your first rip cut safely and effectively. And I want to show you another example here. And instead of using the push stick, we're going to be just pushing the lumber through the blade this time because we're going to be cutting it a little bit wider. So if you follow all the steps that I've taught so far, you'll be able to get a safe, accurate cut every time. And so that is the basic rip cut, just guiding the piece of wood along the rip fence across the blade to get a nice clean cut on the other side. So now we're going to move on to some more advanced cuts. When ripping lumber out on the table saw, most of the time we're making through cuts, which just means that the blade is passing through the top of the lumber, removing a section of the wood completely. However, in woodworking, we also make a lot of non-through cuts, which just means that the blade is passing through the middle of the lumber. And so this is for rabbet joints and also dado cuts. So I actually have a dado stack here. However, this table saw can't house a dado stack, and that's because the arbor is not long enough to house one. So a dado stack is a series of blades in which you can customize the width in which you're cutting out. If your table saw doesn't have the capability of housing a dado stack, or you don't have a dado stack available, you can still achieve a dado-like cut by taking multiple passes over the single blade. And that's going to just widen the curve as you take multiple passes and move the lumber. So I'll show you how to do that as well. So that's all about the dado stack. And I'm going to show you how to make a simple non-through cut first, and then we'll move on to some more advanced techniques. Okay, so when making your first non-through cut, one of the most important things is measuring. So you want to measure out exactly where you want that curve to be cut out at. You want to measure the height on the side of the board, and then you want to measure the position on the end of the board. Now that we have those two measured out, now we can position the rip fence and the blade. So we're going to be putting our mark that we made on the side of the lumber next to the blade and adjusting the blade accordingly to that line. And now all I have to do is position the rip fence on the line we made at the front of the board. So I'm going to move the rip fence and I'm going to position it right on that line. Once that's done, I can lock it in place. And we can go ahead and cut it out. One thing I would mention is that since this is a non-through cut, the riving knife needs to be in the non-through position. So that's your basic non-through rip cut on a table saw, which allows you to cut the width of the blade out in the middle of the lumber. So if we had a dado stack on this table saw installed, if we wanted that kerf to be a 1/2 inch, we would just put on the dado stack to a 1/2 inch, and then we can just simply take one pass, and then we now have a 1/2 inch kerf right there on the wood, and it's ready to go. If you don't have a dado stack, or like me, I can't even house a dado stack on this table saw, we're just going to create multiple kerfs up to a 1/2 inch. Alright, so that's how you can utilize a non-through cut to create an opening for joinery purposes. So now we can take a 1/2 inch thick piece of lumber, this happens to be MDF, and slide it right in the groove we made, and it creates a nice strong joint, especially when you fill that joint with glue. Now I want to discuss what rabbet cuts are. When utilizing a table saw to create a rabbet, we're essentially taking out a rectangular or square portion of the wood in one of the corners. To achieve this cut, we're going to be cutting a kerf one way and then finishing the cut the other way, dislodging that portion of wood. Whenever you go to make a non-through cut such as this one, you're going to want to make sure that your push stick isn't going to be coming in contact with the blade, and if it is, just be utilizing a wooden push stick that can be cut through. We're going to be creating a 1/2 inch rabbet. To accomplish this, we simply have to take 2 cuts that meet together to dislodge that piece of wood. Okay, so we have the first half of this rabbet cut out, and now we simply have to cut out another kerf that meets this one. To do that the most accurately way possible, I'm actually going to see where my blade needs to rest, and that's just simply seeing where the top of that kerf meets the blade. Okay, so now we know the blade height is correct. To dislodge this portion, we simply have to rotate the lumber and cut the kerf out this way. So let's move the rip fence and adjust our cut, lock it in place, and we'll go ahead and finish this rabbet. Alright, so with those 2 simple cuts, you're able to create a rabbet. This can be utilized in a lot of different projects for a lot of different reasons. A lot of the picture frames that I make utilize a rabbet to embed the contents in the wood. So the rabbet cut on a table saw is very useful and something that I utilize a lot. So that's definitely something you want in your toolkit. Okay, so now that I've showed you how to complete a rabbet cut, we're going to be moving on to bevel cuts. And that just means we're going to be tilting the blade. But we can't tilt the blade with the zero clearance insert throat plate, so we're going to be taking that off and putting on the stock DeWalt throat plate. For this example, I'm going to be using this piece of lumber, and we're going to be creating a French cleat. And a French cleat needs a 45-degree angle to make it work, and so we're going to be beveling the blade 45 degrees. The tilt mechanism is going to be on the front of your table saw. A lot of them have markings to where you can lock it in at 45 degrees, so you don't have to do any guesswork or manual measuring. You can also use a digital protractor that just magnetizes onto the blade, and then it'll give you a reading as you tilt the blade. So those are the best ways to measure out your bevel. I'm going to go ahead and use the table saw tilt mechanism to tilt the blade. Okay, once we have the blade tilted to the proper degree, which in this case is 45 degrees for the French cleat, then we just have to make sure that the blade is passing through the top of the lumber. And the easiest way to look at that is just by placing the lumber right beside it and then raising the blade up until it passes over the top. When performing a bevel cut with this thin of lumber, you're going to be utilizing 2 push sticks. One push stick from the side and one push stick from the back, just so that your hands are free and clear of the blade. Okay, so now we got our 45-degree cutout in this board, and we could utilize it as a French cleat. So this goes along the wall, and this piece slides in to hang stuff. And so that's just one example of how you can use a bevel cut on a table saw, but you could utilize it for decorative purposes, maybe for picture frames or cabinetry. Depending on the angle that you use, you'll get different profiles. We'll go ahead and cut a 30-degree angle out next, just to show you what that looks like. Okay, so we just performed bevel cuts by utilizing the rip fence to cut along the grain. But you can also cut perpendicular to the grain by utilizing your miter gauge. For this, we won't need the fence. Any of the cuts that you're performing with the miter gauge, you won't be utilizing the fence anymore. You'll just be using the fence on the miter gauge. So we'll be pushing this up. And now, by utilizing this miter gauge, we can cut bevel cuts perpendicular to the grain by cross-cutting them. So we just performed a bevel cross-cut on the table saw and created nice 30-degree ends on this piece of wood. Next, I want to show you how you can make a compound miter cut by leaving the blade beveled, but also angling the miter gauge fence. All right, so there you have it. With the blade beveled and the miter gauge angled at 45 degrees, we've created a compound miter cut on the table saw. So I've explained some of the capabilities of the bevel cut on the table saw, but let's put it back to 90 degrees so we can move on to some other cuts. If you tilted the blade and then forgot to lock back in that angle and started ripping or cross-cutting boards on the table saw, it would be highly dangerous. So just go down, make sure that you have that angle locked back in. Bunch of different table saws have different locking mechanisms. Just make sure that blade is secured in that position. All right, so now we just performed a 90-degree crosscut as well as a angled miter cut on the table saw. And the angled miter cuts are perfect if you're making picture frames. I just created a 45-degree angle, super simple, on the table saw, and a couple more of those, and you got yourself a picture frame. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Mitered angle cuts on the table saw could do similar tasks as a miter saw. Another important cut you can make on a table saw with a miter gauge is a dado cut. And the dado runs perpendicular to the grain. So kind of like the groove cut with the grain that we've already created, this one's similar but perpendicular to the grain. And that can be achieved by using a miter gauge. Now, we only can use the curve of the blade with this table saw. However, this is the perfect use for a dado stack. You'll install the dado stack and then you'll be able to cut out whatever width that you want in the wood. And this is typically used for shelving and joinery purposes. Now, in this instance, we're going to be measuring and then cutting out curves as we slide the piece of wood over. By lowering our blade to a non-through cut position and by utilizing the miter gauge, we're able to create a nice dado, and it can be used for some really good joinery. I've showed you these examples with the stock miter gauge that came with the DeWalt job site table saw, and it performed pretty well. However, for more accurate cuts, I again would highly recommend buying an aftermarket miter gauge for your table saw, and that's going to make cross-cutting really awesome on the table saw. You're going to have better features and more accuracy when it comes to cross-cutting. Now, one thing you can do is build a crosscut sled. So next, we're going to be covering the crosscut sled and why you should make one for your table saw. Table saw crosscut jigs come in all shapes and sizes with all sorts of different bells and whistles. This one in particular is about as simple as you can get, and it performs really well and does everything I needed to do. The main thing about a crosscut jig is that the back fence here is perfectly perpendicular to the blade to give you accurate cuts every time. One benefit to this jig is that you could get repeatable cuts, so I can easily attach a stop block and then slide the board in, cut it out, and then do the same thing over and over again, and very accurately, very repeatable. Another benefit to this jig is that I can handle smaller work pieces much better than I would if I didn't have one. There are many different types of cuts that you can make with a table saw sled, but the first example I want to give you is the half lap joint. So we're going to be creating a half lap on these two boards to give you an example of the capabilities of a crosscut jig. The first thing we'll need to do to set up this half lap joint is to measure half the thickness of this board so the two pieces overlap and create one solid piece. After we have half of the board's thickness marked, we can go ahead and set the blade height. With the blade set at half the thickness of the lumber, we'll go ahead and cut both of these boards out by running passes over the blade until we've cleared the board. Well, I can tell you that the benefits of having a crosscut sled like this one doesn't stop at half lap joints. You can create accurate dado cuts, repeatable cuts on thin boards, and handle small materials safely and effectively. There are hundreds of videos out there on ways you can build a table saw sled just like this one. There are ones with more bells and whistles and much more capabilities. So that's something you're going to want to look into. but I highly recommend you building one because it's going to enhance the capabilities of your table saw. The next jig that I'm excited to share with you is this joiner / tapering jig. And the reason I built this jig was because I had a lot of boards that had live edge on both sides. And so I couldn't run it through the table saw, and it surely wasn't going to be easy to joint. So this jointer / tapering jig can do some similar operations as a jointer, however, much more slowly and not as efficiently as a large capacity jointer. However, if you don't have a jointer, this could joint your boards. And so that's huge. If you do have a board that has straight edges, this comes in handy as a tapering jig. So if we wanted to put a taper on this board, we simply adjust the board at whatever angle we want to cut, and then simply clamp it down to the jig. So I'm going to show you an example of that and how you can use this jig to taper. Alright, so that's just how easy and effectively that this jig can create a tapered leg. Now if you're working with thinner pieces of wood that can't go to the edge, all we have to do is flip the jig around. So we'll go ahead and flip this jig, and we'll use the other side. So if you had a small table leg like that and you need to create a taper on it, so that's how you can effectively create tapered legs with a tapering jig. There's all kinds of different tapering jigs. However, I do like this one and I primarily use it as a jointer jig. That's why I made it. But it also serves as a tapering jig as well when I need it to do so. And if you have a really uneven board that needs to be secured down to rip, well, this is also a perfect solution. So this jig comes in handy. It's cheap to build, and I definitely recommend having one if you want to really focus in on the tapering aspect of the jig. There are better tapering jigs, and that's something you'll want to look for online if you want to be able to make really nice and repeatable tapers just like this one. But this jig definitely comes in handy, and I would definitely recommend having one. So far, we've covered the crosscut sled jig, which is super important for woodworking. We've also covered the jointer / tapering jig, and those jigs could be separately made for their specific uses. Lastly, I'll be covering the spline jig, and what this does is it creates a kerf in mitered corners of picture frames or boxes, and it not only reinforces those joints, but it creates kind of a cool aesthetic appeal to your woodworking projects. So how this works is the blade passes through the middle of the jig, and then your mitered corner, whether that's a picture frame or a box, rests in this 90-degree area right here, and then the blade passes at a perfect angle to that mitered corner, and then you simply fill that corner in with your choice of wood, whether that be walnut, cherry, maple, something that contrasts the other wood that you're already working with. And so that creates the cool aesthetic appeal and also reinforces your miter joints. So that's how that works, and I've really enjoyed it. I really like making boxes and creating those splines in the corners. And if you're creating picture frames, this is also something that can be very useful. So this is something you want to keep in mind when you're getting more into the advanced woodworking and you want to create spline mitered corners. The next technique that I want to show you on the table saw is one of the more advanced techniques that I know, and that's cove cutting. You oftentimes find coves in cove molding for houses, and it's basically a semicircle in the wood, and it's super cool that you can actually create those on your own with a table saw. And I've often done this on picture frames and other decorative items like that. So to get started with a cove cut, you're going to want to remove the fence completely because we won't need it. Okay, so once you have your fence completely out of the way or removed from your table saw completely, which is ideal, we're going to be removing the throat plate and then removing the riving knife. This is one of those rare circumstances that you actually won't be needing the riving knife. Now that we have the riving knife removed, we'll go ahead and place the throat plate back on. Okay, so now we have the rip fence removed off of the table saw or out of the way. We have a long straight edge to act as our new fence, which is going to be going diagonally. We have the riving knife removed and the throat plate placed back on and the blade raised up just a little bit. Now we can arrange the fence and the piece of wood so that the wood passes through the blade and that cove or the semicircle is perfectly in the middle of the lumber. And you want to make sure as you take passes and create this cove that there's wood on the left side and the right side still, so that the wood actually has support on either side and you don't cut one of the edges out. That'll ruin your cove. So you have to make sure that the wood is balanced on either side. So there's some wood left on the left side and there's some wood left on the right side, and the cove is being cut out in the center of the lumber. Now, after this is all set up, you're going to want to clamp this temporary fence onto your table saw in some manner. Alright, so now our temporary fence is aligned properly and securely clamped to the table saw. So now we can begin our cove cut, but not until we lower the blade. So we're going to lower the blade just so about a 1/16 or a little bit more than that is showing. So as you make the cove cut, you simply have to keep raising the blade and the cove will become deeper and deeper until it looks exactly how you envisioned. Alright, by following those simple steps, you can create a cove just like this one. And so this piece would be great for a picture frame or cove molding or any decorative element for your woodworking projects. Now, that cove is not the only cove you can create. So you can see the apex is right in the center. So this is basically a perfect semicircle. However, you can change the apex of that circle and it makes it even more decorative. I have the bevel at 45 degrees, which will be the most drastic apex, and you'll definitely see the difference between this cove and the last cove that we just cut out. We want to make sure that the blade is all the way lower down and then raise it up just so that the teeth are showing. And then we'll make our first pass, and every pass after that, we'll just raise the blade up one full turn until we get the desired cove cut. You want to make sure that the bevel is beveling towards the piece of wood, and that's going to cut much better and much safer. Well, from the simplest rip cut in the beginning to the most complex cove cut that I can think of, the table saw is the most versatile tool in the wood shop. In this video, we covered a lot of different topics. I went over a lot of different tips, tricks, and techniques, and showed you a lot of different types of cuts. If you need any more information on anything that I did in this video or any of the cuts that I performed, just leave me a comment. If you followed along with this whole tutorial and followed the steps that I took to create all of these cuts, not only are you going to be a safe woodworker, but you're going to start acquiring some of the skills needed for your future woodworking projects. I can tell you that the table saw is one of the most versatile machines in the wood shop and highly valuable because of all the different cuts that you can make. Don't try to perform any of the cuts or techniques shown in this video if you aren't comfortable doing so. If you need more knowledge before making a cut, I would just search for more videos that go into more detail on that topic. Well, that about wraps up this tutorial on the table saw. I really hope you enjoyed this content and found it valuable, and if you did, don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe, and comment on this video. All three of those things help out this video greatly, and I really appreciate it. So, I wish you the best of luck on your future woodworking projects. Always stay safe on the table saw, and I'll see you in the next video.
Shop Fix. It's for the love of woodworking.